All right, so we're diving into the aftermath of Hurricane Milton down in Florida. You sent over a really interesting batch of articles from The Independent. And there's a lot to dig into here. We're seeing the immediate recovery efforts. We're also seeing some political clashes starting to emerge around the disaster aid. And then, just the human stories. Those always seem to surface after something like this.
Yeah, I think that's what's so important to remember. We often focus on the immediate impact, but this is just the beginning, It's those ripple effects, those long-term challenges. That's really what we're talking about.
Exactly. And these articles, they don't hold back. They really paint a picture of the situation there in Florida. Hurricane Milton, a Category 3 at landfall. Already 17 lives lost, hundreds of thousands without power. And the damage estimates are in the billions.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's just the beginning. What are some of the most pressing challenges right now?
Well, the flooding risk is a big one for sure. The articles highlight some real dangers, especially north of Tampa. And the thing is, this flooding could be a problem for weeks. So you have these communities already reeling from the initial hit, and now they've got this ongoing threat hanging over them.
It's like trying to rebuild when the ground is still shaking. And on that note, one article that stood out to me was about Florida hotels. You'd assume they'd be packed with people who'd been displaced, right? But it's actually repair crews and relief workers filling them up. What does that tell you about the situation?
It shows just how massive this disaster is. First of all, you have this huge influx of workers, which is obviously necessary. But it puts a strain on resources. And logistically, it just underscores how difficult it is to get aid where it needs to be.
Right. And then there's the human cost. And that's something you can't put a price tag on, really. One article mentioned President Biden visiting Florida. He pledged over $600 million to help strengthen their electric grid. That sounds, at least on the surface, like a positive step.
Oh, absolutely. It's a significant investment. And focusing on grid resilience, that's key, especially with these predictions of more intense storms. This could be a turning point for Florida, we'll see. But it's important to think long-term here, Is this a one-time thing, or will we see continued investment? And how does this $600 million stack up against past disaster relief? These are the questions we should be asking.
It's always good to have you here to ask those tough questions. Yeah. And you mentioned the scale of it all. Over 900,000 homes were still in the dark days after the storm hit. I can't even imagine.
It's tough, and it just shows how vulnerable we are. And it's not just homes, it's businesses, it's hospitals. Entire communities are paralyzed when the power goes out. The economic and social impact of that is massive.
And sometimes it's those personal stories that really hit home. I was reading about this couple from Tennessee. They'd moved to Siesta Key, and they've been flooded out 6 times in just 14 months.
Yeah.
6 times. It makes you wonder what goes through people's minds when they face that kind of repeated devastation.
It's heartbreaking, honestly, but it also points to a bigger issue, climate change and displacement. As these extreme weather events become more common, more people are going to be forced to make these agonizing decisions. Do we stay and rebuild, or do we leave? And these are decisions no one should have to make.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the long-term impact, not just the physical damage, but the emotional and mental toll as well. And speaking of difficult choices, these articles also touch on the political fallout from Hurricane Milton. What were your thoughts on that aspect of the coverage?
What's interesting, isn't it, how these events become so politicized? You have President Biden on the ground promising aid and support, and then you have House Speaker Mike Johnson saying that hurricane aid can wait until after the November elections. It's a stark contrast, and it really highlights that tension between the immediate needs after a disaster and these political calculations.
It's like they're 2 completely different worlds colliding. You've got this very real crisis happening right now, people trying to put their lives back together. And then in the background, you have this political game playing out.
Right. And unfortunately, it's the people affected by the hurricane who are caught in the middle. Delaying aid for political reasons, it has real-world consequences. It can mean families struggling for basic necessities, businesses unable to rebuild.
Absolutely. It can also erode trust in those who are supposed to be leading the recovery effort. Creates a sense of cynicism. Like people aren't being heard. And speaking of feeling overlooked, there was an article about hotel workers. They're dealing with this huge influx of repair crews. It's another side of the story we don't always think about.
Right. We tend to focus on the most immediate impacts.
But these workers are facing their own set of challenges.
They've got different clientele, different demands, all while probably dealing with their own personal experiences from the hurricane.
Yeah, it just goes to show how far-reaching the impact of an event like this can be. Everyone's affected in some way, even if it's not always obvious.
Exactly. And I think recognizing that interconnectedness is crucial. if we really want to understand what it means to recover and build resilience.
While we're talking about the political fallout, these articles did mention former President Trump in relation to Hurricane Milton. Did you get a sense from these articles about what his involvement has been?
Well, they alluded to some actions he's taken, but honestly, there weren't a lot of specifics. I think it's important for us to stick with the information presented in the articles and not speculate.
Right, of course, but it could be something to look into further if anyone's interested.
Absolutely. Always good to do your own research.
Okay, so bringing it back to Hurricane Milton, we've covered a lot. The immediate response, the political battles, the human impact. What are some of the key takeaways that really stand out to you from these articles?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just the sheer scale of this disaster. Hurricane Milton, it wasn't just a natural disaster. It's a social crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, all rolled into one. And the impact of this thing is going to be felt for a long, long time.
I agree. And while the focus right now is obviously on rescue and relief, these articles also force us to think about the future. As climate change makes these hurricanes more frequent, more intense, how do we even begin to prepare for a world where events like this become the norm?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not just about reacting after the fact, right? It's about taking steps now to try to prevent this level of devastation in the future.
Well, these articles really make you think about that, don't they? Because it's not enough to just build things back stronger, although that's obviously important. We need to rethink building codes, create more resilient communities. And honestly, we have to address climate change because that's what's fueling these more frequent, more intense hurricanes.
It's a huge task, and it requires everyone working together.
Right.
But when you see the political infighting, like with the debate over aid, it does make you wonder if we're up to the challenge.
Yeah, I get that. There's often this disconnect between what needs to happen on the ground and the pace of political action. But what I did find encouraging in these articles were those human stories, like the couple from Tennessee, the hotel workers. They put a human face on this disaster. And those stories can be powerful, They can help build the political will to actually make meaningful changes.
It's a good reminder that behind all the headlines, all the statistics, there are real people whose lives have been upended. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think that's what we should all keep in mind. What's happening in Florida right now in the wake of Hurricane Milton, it's not just a news story.
No, it's a wake-up call.
Exactly.
And for you listening, the question is, how will you respond? Will you stay informed, get involved, push for change, or will you just become numb to it all, to the headlines and the devastation?
Because one thing's for certain, these storms aren't going away.
Not by a long shot.
And the choices we make now, both individually and as a society, are going to determine what the future looks like. Not just for Florida, but for everyone who lives along our coast.
That's something to think about. Until next time.